Following the democratic takeover of the United States, which has been exposed by the latest DEI and woke chains temporarily held in check by President Trump, the release of these leftist, postmodern fanatics is fundamental to the principles of human rights, democracy, and free speech. These angry activists provide circuit breakers for people representing conservative and right-wing values as well as Jews. For the latter, there is a direct existential need. Intoxicated by some sick Islamophilia, they support a religious and cultural system that should not even exist on Earth for civilized humanity. And the main motivator is extremely sick anti-Semitism. Supporting the bloody regime in Iran, which could result in that regime acquiring nuclear weapons and, consequently, a direct attack on Israel, poses an extraordinary but very real threat. The frog is already boiling. Any reasonable person should have not only red flags on their heads, but even red spotlights. Dei's fanatics don't engage in any substantive discussions. They destroy. There's no discussion, nothing. Therefore, today I'd like to present excerpts from a text by Canadian academic Paul Finlayson, who experienced this very same extreme, deviant attack firsthand and was destroyed by this leftist activist movement. These people now openly espouse Nazi Hitlerite ideology without any embarrassment. In their extreme anti-Semitic hatred, they are ready to praise the Holocaust and even, as Paul Finlayson will point out, regret that they did not live during Hitler's reign and could not have murdered Jews themselves. Paul Finlayson's story should serve as a warning, a final warning to people who value their democratic values and freedom of speech, and to Western civilization in general, because it is currently under serious threat. I recently watched an interview with a Stanford student who called herself a pre-med, one of those modern, prestigious terms meant to signal seriousness, intelligence, ambition, and membership in the professional elite. Stanford, of course, is not your average college on the highway. It's one of the most important universities in the Western world, a vast certificate factory for the management class, churning out future doctors, lawyers, professors, regulators, journalists, administrators, and political leaders. And this young woman admitted, almost in passing, that in the days immediately following October 7th, she believed that Israel had invaded Gaza on October 7th. She literally believed that the triggering event of October 7th was the Israeli invasion of Gaza. And she didn't reach this conclusion after analyzing the evidence, not after reading a chronology of events, not after familiarizing herself with witness accounts, recordings, or the historical context. She simply absorbed the narrative, absorbed the atmosphere. But the truly terrifying thing wasn't that she was wrong. People have always been wrong. Ignorance itself isn't the greatest threat to civilization because ignorance can be corrected. The truly terrifying thing was the certainty, the moral intoxication. She wore a keffiyeh, shouted slogans, insulted Jews on campus. She joined the ecstatic crowd, certain of her own righteousness, never once making the basic effort to verify whether the very premise was true. And this wasn't some anonymous internet nutjob steeped in online conspiracy theories. This was Stanford University. This was the future professional elite of the West. Ultimately, to her credit, she had been somehow deprogrammed by conflict with facts, conversations, and reality breaking through the walls of ideological hysteria. She escaped the narrative prison she'd entered, but that only makes the story all the more disturbing, because it means that an intelligent young woman from one of the world's most prestigious universities could almost instantly be swept up in a state of moral certainty so powerful that she was willing to publicly slander strangers, scream insults at Jews, and participate in collective madness without once pausing to ask the most primitive question possible. Check the facts. My own descent into nutritional madness began with a claim that, in any sane civilization, would have evoked agreement or disagreement, perhaps even a violent argument, but certainly not a professional death sentence. Shortly after October 7th, I told a stranger outside the university that Hamas were Nazis because of the historical and ideological links between the Muslim Brotherhood and Nazi Germany, a historical account that is not controversial among serious historians. Hamas openly calls for genocidal violence against Jews, glorifies mass murder, celebrates burning entire families alive, and elevates extermination rhetoric to the level of moral theater. Linking such an organization to Nazism wasn't some deranged fabrication. It was a historical and moral analogy, and a historical connection. But what followed wasn't discord, it was hysteria. A solemn, medieval hysteria, reminiscent of witch trials, erupted almost immediately around me. Not because I had incited violence, not because I had threatened anyone, not because I had harassed students, but because I had violated the sacred narrative that Muslim sensibilities are inviolable, sacred, and morally sovereign. A man who publicly called Jews subhumans who worshiped the devil, who praised those who burned entire families alive, who published grotesquely anti-Semitic content online, his outrage was treated as a holy revelation.
If he felt offended, I had to be banished, purged, cast out. Witches had to be burned at the stake. And then the atmosphere became truly terrifying. I'm convinced that one of the few things that stopped the actual violence against me was simply the fact that I was already home and off campus when the hysteria erupted. That's how heated the situation was. So quickly did the narrative erupt, bypassing all the civilized safeguards supposedly inherent in higher education. And then, something truly astonishing happened. 4 weeks before the charges were formally brought against me, the university vice-chancellor reportedly went around openly telling staff and faculty that no matter what happened, I would be fired. Even before the evidence, before the investigation, before the testimony, before the accused's testimony, before any procedure even remotely resembling elementary principles of justice. And none of the highly educated people observing the proceedings seemed concerned. Not the vice-chancellor, not the deputy vice-chancellor, not the dean of the University of Guelph's Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, not the administrators drafting the decision letters, not the investigators, not the human rights bureaucracy. These weren't ignorant people. These were educated people, people with doctorates, publications, conferences, prestige, institutional power, and careers built in organizations supposedly dedicated to reason, inquiry, and evidence. This isn't happening on the margins of society. It's happening at its center. And most grotesquely, the people who ultimately decided my fate never met with me, not even once, never spoke to me, never agreed to a meeting, never responded to a single email. I wrote appeals, pointed out contradictions, showed how their own documents and procedures were blatantly violated, and explained that the basic principles of procedural fairness, the very foundations of Western legal civilization, were being abandoned before our eyes. I pointed out that the accusations were anonymous, the evidence unverified, the conclusions predetermined, and the process abandoned. There was no response, not a single one. Instead, my supposed hearing, my supposed trial, was simply canceled, and I was dismissed. And then came the final abomination. The more I defended myself, the more the institution treated my very defense as a form of misconduct. The very act of defending myself became harassment. The very pointing out of procedural breakdown became repression. Please consider carefully the folly of this construction. The accused, demanding a fair trial, became, in their logic, the aggressor. The person pointing out the falsehood became the problem. The very act of applying critical thinking at the university became evidence of guilt. I was expected to quietly go to the stake. I was expected to calmly accept exile. And ultimately, of course, I was dismissed. This is the University of Guelph. This is Humber College. And the truly sad thing is that these are not exceptional institutions. They are.
The modern university increasingly fails to teach critical thinking. It teaches people to choose accepted narratives and defend them emotionally. Entire fields of the humanities have ceased to function as research disciplines and have begun to function as ideological churches, where conclusions are predetermined and evidence is admitted only if it reinforces an approved moral framework. A narrative is no longer a hypothesis to be tested, No longer a temporary framework awaiting proof. It is a tribal identity marker, a branding exercise, a moral accessory of an intellectual fashion magazine. People no longer ask if it's true, they ask what believing it says about me. Adopting a narrative has become a moral cosmetic. An individual chooses a narrative like choosing an Instagram profile or a fashionable outfit. This is meant to signal belonging, compassion, enlightenment, sophistication, and moral righteousness. Hamas is, above all, a resistance movement, not a theocratic death cult. Palestine has always existed as a coherent nation-state. Western civilization is uniquely evil compared to other civilizations. Slavery was uniquely Western, despite millennia of Arab, African, Ottoman, and Asian slave systems. All indigenous communities lived in an ecological and moral utopia before the arrival of Europeans. Criticism of Islam is inherently hateful, while criticism of Christianity is a sign of enlightened sophistication. Masculinity itself is dangerous. Dissent constitutes violence. Emotional discomfort constitutes harm. Silence is violence. Objective truth is oppressive. Biology is subordinated to ideology. Women can have penises, and the very questioning of this assertion constitutes a transgression. Any disparity is evidence of discrimination. Lived experience trumps empirical evidence. Mere accusation constitutes proof. Intentions no longer matter. Censorship protects democracy. Free speech is dangerous. Meritocracy is inherently unjust. Feelings authenticate truth. The West is systemically racist, while non-Western societies are somehow exempt from moral judgment. Disinformation increasingly signifies simple disagreement with prior consensus. Universities have ceased to be engines of inquiry, they have become mechanisms of ideological selection. Emotional validation is morally superior to critical inquiry. Borders are immoral in the West, but liberating elsewhere. Nationalism in Europe or North America is dangerous, while nationalism elsewhere constitutes an anti-colonial virtue. Capitalism is singularly exploitative, while communist regimes merely made mistakes. All social problems can be solved through administrative bureaucracy. Diversity itself is proof of institutional virtue, regardless of the institution's competence. Anti-Semitism must be endlessly contextualized and justified, while every other form of prejudice is treated as a threat to civilization. Canada is fundamentally genocidal, despite being one of the freest and most prosperous societies in human history. The narrative of graves at residential schools in Kamloops required no evidence before it unleashed national history and international condemnation. Decolonization is a coherent philosophy of governance, not a flexible slogan stretched to encompass utterly contradictory impulses. Emotions are evidence. None of these narratives holds up particularly well to sustained analysis, and the analysis itself has become socially offensive. And this is the real crisis. Not that there is any falsehood has always existed. The crisis lies in the fact that the very examination of reality is increasingly treated as an act of aggression. The Enlightenment, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, rested on a few stubborn assumptions. That truth exists, that evidence matters, that contradictions matter, that objective reality exists independently of emotions, and that reason is man's best tool for approaching truth. Imperfect, but honest. Yet, over the past half-century, large swaths of the academy, particularly in the humanities, have systematically dismantled these assumptions. Under the influence of postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, truth itself began to be presented not as a discoverable reality, but as an expression of power. We were told that truth was socially constructed. Objectivity was an illusion. Facts were merely narratives produced by systems of domination. And the Academy, in its pride, increasingly convinced itself that it had killed the Judeo-Christian God. Through moral relativism, narrative absolutism, and the cult of subjective identity over objective truth, many members of our intellectual class today behave as if they were dancing triumphantly on God's grave. Emails saying, "We refuse to represent the master," become unfortunate misunderstandings. 11 months of silence become strategic considerations. Abandonment becomes discretion. Ideological hostility becomes merely a communication problem. A union member begging for representation becomes a problem because his very existence threatens the narrative. The same union, OPSE, that treated my statement, "Nazis are boor," as some kind of moral transgression serious enough to justify abandoning me, recently had one of its campaign managers publicly exposed by the Canary Mission for expressing admiration for Hitler's project to exterminate Jews. It wasn't that this person had made a clumsy comment about Middle Eastern politics. The accusation was that he wished he had lived during Hitler's time so he could also have participated in the glorious mission of ridding the world of Jews. Let's pause for a moment and consider the moral reversal required in this situation. A professor saying, "I stand with Israel," becomes radioactive. A union official glorifying Hitler becomes, at best, an inconvenient administrative problem. The union refuses to fire him. And one suspects, indeed one can already see the outlines of this reaction, that this too will be rationalized by the union apparatus. It will become context, nuance, complexity, an isolated incident, perhaps something irrelevant, perhaps something inappropriate to mention, perhaps another communication problem. Because again, the narrative must be protected at all costs. The union is the good people. Therefore, evidence contrary to the narrative cannot truly matter. And when institutions assume that certain actors are morally sanctified, no amount of evidence can overcome this presumption. A Jewish union member abandoned by his own union becomes suspect. A union activist praising Hitler becomes someone redeemable. The institution doesn't follow the facts to the conclusions. It starts with the conclusions and then edits the facts to preserve them. This is the real disease. Not just bias, not just cowardice, but the complete replacement of moral reasoning with ideological, herd thinking masquerading as justice. Because if a union can act vindictively, ideologically, discriminatorily, if a workplace institution can knowingly allow a lack of representation and yet still call it representation, then the mythology shatters. The comforting fairy tale crumbles. The public might begin to understand that institutions don't remain moral just because they describe themselves as such. And so the system bends itself in intellectual acrobatics to preserve the narrative. The union tried, the union had good intentions, the union is the good people. Even when it outright abandons its member, even when it refuses to read their emails, even when it functionally and ideologically sides with the employer against the employee it had a legal duty to protect. The narrative must survive, because narrative now trumps facts. And where can one— This text is not intended to be an attempt at proselytizing. I was raised in the Christian faith, then left it for almost 25 years. I considered myself too rational, too sophisticated, too intellectually developed for religion, but I returned to it. And ultimately, although ideologically I will stand alongside my Jewish brothers and sisters against the madness engulfing the West, it is precisely to this Christian faith of mine that I return. This is now the foundation of my life, in a civilization increasingly tainted by ego. Branding, self-enrichment, institutional vanity, and a collective delusion masquerading as enlightenment. Perhaps, in writing all this, I am truly chasing the wind. I know I will not catch it, and I already know that my true foundation will not be found in the approval of institutions, labor councils, universities, administrators, journalists, or ideological crowds. It will be found in faith, in a true narrative that transcends branding, and in the persistent belief that beneath all the slogans and hysteria, something eternal still exists. A civilization that abandons truth in favor of narrative ultimately does more than confuse justice with hysteria, inquiry with propaganda, or wisdom with performance. It begins to lose the very ability to distinguish reality from fiction. And this is precisely the true danger of narrative culture. Not only that people first choose a conclusion and only then fit the evidence to it, though this in itself is intellectually dishonest, but that the entire process gradually erodes the civilization's respect for truth as an objective concept. Truth becomes outdated. Evidence recedes into the background. Reason itself begins to arouse suspicion, even seem unmanly, because reason is slow, disciplined, and often inconvenient for the emotional satisfactions of ideology. And in the resulting vacuum, society slips away from truth and toward emotional plausibility. This poisonous contemporary doctrine, according to which something need not be true as long as it morally satisfies the tribe that repeats it. At this point, falsehood ceases to be considered a flaw. It becomes a political tool. Narrative becomes sacred. Evidence becomes editable. Language becomes flexible. Institutions stop asking if it's true and start asking only if it serves the story we want to tell. And when a society reaches this stage, it has already entered Orwellian territory, whether or not it dares to admit it. Because democracies rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They disintegrate gradually through the normalization of intellectual cowardice, through bureaucracies that reward conformity over honesty, through institutions that protect narratives rather than facts, through citizens trained to fear social exclusion more than falsehood itself. And then, one morning, people will wake up stunned, standing amid the ruins of freedoms they believed to be permanent, and they will ask, how did this happen? How did we get to this place? But the answer was there all along. We were warned the moment truth became negotiable.